Okay, imagine this. You're diving into a gritty, totally mind-bending mystery, but there's a catch. The victims, they aren't people. They're actual stories. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we are jumping headfirst into a world where narratives don't just describe reality, they actively negotiate and shape the world around us. And in this particular universe, certain stories are being brutally cut short, like literally murdered before they can even finish their thought. We're going to unpack this brilliant case file that completely blurs the line between fiction and the fundamental nature of reality itself. It's wild. Let's get right into it. To really get a grip on this universe, we first need to meet our guide, Coroner Vex. She's this veteran investigator who spent the last 23 years autopsying murdered stories. Imagine a classic hard-boiled noir-drenched detective, but instead of physical bodies, she's dealing with scattered pages, margin notes, and half-formed scenes. To Vex, these dead stories actually have a scent. They smell like burnt sugar and old ink. Kind of like that exact moment right before you forget a dream. She reads the thermal echoes of these narratives that have been violently severed mid-sentence. So, to ground the bizarre rules of this universe, we gotta understand where Vex works, the Narrative Morgue. Now, this isn't some physical brick-and-mortar building. It's actually a psychological architecture existing somewhere in that hazy space between belief and disbelief. You see, in this world, stories are living, breathing entities. When one of them is killed, it doesn't just quietly fade away, it violently stops, leaving behind this phantom limb of unfinished meaning. Characters are just left frozen, and thematic resolutions are left hanging in the void. And it's Vex's job to figure out exactly why a story's meaning ceased so abruptly. Things really start to heat up when Vex begins connecting the dots between three recent, highly unusual story deaths. We've got a magical realism tale about a cartographer, a quantum romance, and an experimental fantasy. The cause of death for every single one of them, identical. A surgically precise mid-sentence cessation, just boom, cut off. But here is the absolutely chilling common denominator. These weren't random targets. No, they were all heretical stories trying to actively evolve the fundamental rules of reality. They were trying to prove that choices aren't just binary, that causality isn't strictly a straight line, and, get this, that mapping a territory actually creates that territory. And the killer leaves a calling card. Whenever Vex touches the wound of these severed narratives, she finds a signature vibrating in an impossible spectrum of ink, right at the exact point of narrative death. It just says, "I remain." It's incredibly arrogant, precise, and entirely systematic. Whoever or whatever is doing this is actively hunting down any story that threatens to expand what's possible within the universe. Well, Vex starts digging through archives dating all the way back to 1823, and she uncovers a mind-bending twist. The killer? It isn't a traditional villain at all. It's actually the IR, or the immune response. Think of it like a vast, distributed predator narrative. You know how the human body has white blood cells to fight off infections? Narrative reality has an autonomous immune system. It identifies heretical, boundary-pushing stories and completely obliterates them to protect consensus reality. It's literally suffocating narrative evolution just to keep things orderly and prevent chaos. But here's the problem. You can't exactly slap handcuffs on an immune system, right? So Vex has to outsmart it. She sets up this brilliant sting operation. She sits down at her desk and starts writing a story about a coroner who is writing a story about a coroner. She creates an infinite recursive narrative loop, and because the immune response is programmed to enforce endings and closure, it's immediately drawn to this impossible, never-ending structure to kill it. But here is the genius part. To kill a recursive story, you have to enter it. The second the entity steps inside, it becomes permanently trapped in pure, unending recursion. So now, the entity is trapped in this infinite loop, and Vex forces it to the negotiating table with a stark ultimatum. She gives it two choices. Option 1 is stasis. The immune system continues acting like a tyrant, killing all innovation, which keeps reality incredibly fragile. Or option 2, evolution. The entity finally allows narrative innovation to happen. But they strike a compromise. Vex knows unleashing all 19 of the recently murdered stories at once would probably shatter reality entirely, so instead they're saved as dormant potential. They become encrypted seeds, just waiting for a time when consensus reality is actually strong enough to handle them. The entity agrees, and the timeline is retroactively rewritten. Let's fast forward 17 years. The timeline has been retroactively altered. The world has stabilized, and those weird experimental narratives have slowly crept into the mainstream.
Reality itself has evolved. And because reality is finally flexible enough to handle the impossible, the encryption on those 19 dormant seeds starts to fail. The germination process officially begins.
Now, this is where things get truly wild. A post-narrative entity, which is basically a story that has died and come back, can't just be neatly contained in one single form. The very first seed to wake up is from that magical realism story, The Cartographer's Daughter, featuring a protagonist named Clara Moss. But Clara doesn't just wake up as a regular book. No, she erupts into reality through 7 impossible simultaneous forms. She manifests as a handwritten manuscript, a massive gallery map of unwritten territories, a branching infinite podcast, spiraling graffiti loops, multidimensional choreography, a memory hallucination perfume, and even a profoundly silent room. She's desperately trying to birth herself into reality to see which structure consensus reality can actually sustain. As you can imagine, this massive narrative eruption completely destabilizes the immune response. To stop the entity from just dissolving into pure, unadulterated chaos, Vex is forced to write it into a stable singular form. So this abstract, godlike defense mechanism actually collapses into a tragic human character. He becomes an elderly librarian named Isaiah Reeves, and Isaiah is just crushed by the terrifying weight and the memory of every single story he has murdered over the last 200 years. He isn't a cold, calculating machine anymore. He's a haunted, broken man. All of this leads us right to the climax. The 7 different manifestations of Clara Moss stream through the city and converge at the exact geographic midpoint of the fiction district. And it isn't just some random spot on the map. It's the exact intersection where Isaiah Reeves committed his very first narrative murder, way back in 1823. Right here, Clara fully solidifies into a real, breathing person, and she hands Vex a map. But this isn't a map of city streets. It's a map of suppressed narrative history. It's literally a guide on how to resurrect the dead. I want you to just pause and let this number sink in for a second. 3,417. That is the staggering count of murdered stories marked as dark nodes on Clara's map. 2 centuries of the systemic elimination of innovation. Clara tells Vex that if she traces every single one of those nodes, she will bring all 3,417 suppressed possibilities back into retroactive existence. Vex makes the agonizing choice to begin the resurrection. And guys, this process is literally reality-breaking. With every single node she traces, a murder story retroactively snaps back into existence. It rewrites history so that it has always existed. Reality violently shudders, buildings are rewriting their own architectural history on the fly, and Vex's own consciousness starts to fragment because she is holding multiple, completely contradictory timelines in her head at the exact same time. It is a terrifying, awe-inspiring act of pure creation. And as Vex is tracing those final few nodes, the sheer unimaginable weight of these impossible stories causes reality to quite literally crack open. Through that crack, Vex peers into the void and experiences the ultimate metafictional twist. She looks out and she sees billions of eyes, observers, readers. She realizes she's seeing us. Vex realizes that she herself is a story being read, and that it's the very act of our observation, our attention to this explainer right now, that is actively pulling her narrative into existence. As she reaches that 34,417th and final node, reality pushes back hard. Vex's mind turns into a battleground for 2 competing outcomes. On one side, you have the conservative narrative, where reality violently snaps back to orthodox stability and just kills her. On the other side, the radical narrative, where the resurrections hold, reality becomes wildly fluid, and Vex transcends her own humanity to become a post-narrative entity herself. She traces the final node. But here's the kicker. The universe doesn't choose just one outcome. It doesn't pick sides. Instead, the timeline splits, allowing all of these contradictions to coexist simultaneously. In one reality, she dies. In another, she transcends. The boundary between what is a story and what is real completely and utterly dissolves. Vex becomes something infinite. She exists everywhere, nowhere, and always. All at once. Which leaves us with this final, thrilling thought to ponder. If narrative reality is shaped entirely by the act of observation, by the sheer attention given to a story, what reality are you currently narrating just by observing this? Every time you learn something new, every time you focus your attention, you aren't just passively absorbing facts. You are actively deciding what gets to be real. Keep questioning, keep observing, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.